Well, hello, everybody, and thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to join us here for this important town hall organized by Anxiety Canada. My name is Dan Murphy. I will be your moderator today. We have three excellent panelists, experts in the field of anxiety and mental health, which I will introduce you to in a moment. As you know, we have been thrust into the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic for about 5 weeks now, which has been a very difficult time for almost everyone, but especially those prone to anxiety, as day-to-day life has been impacted significantly. I have no expertise in the field of anxiety or mental health. I'm a sports broadcaster, have been for 2 decades. I host hockey games. No history of mental illness, but with a wife, young daughter, mortgage, job that depends on large gatherings, and no set date for things to be somewhat normal again, it's impossible not to feel anxious at times about the health and safety of my family, the impact this will have on my job and income, and just what everyday life will look like once we get past these unprecedented times. So today, our three anxiety experts will be providing practical strategies to cope with anxiety while self-isolating. We'll also introduce you to the MindShift app, an incredible resource, and we'll take some time for questions from those of you at home. So with that said, let me introduce you to the three lovely doctors that will be helping us today. Dr. Maureen Whittal, psychologist and director of Vancouver CBT Center and co-founder of Anxiety Canada. We have also Dr. Anne-Marie Albano, founder of the Columbia University Clinic for Anxiety and Related Disorders, and Dr. Melanie Badawi, psychologist, North Shore Stress and Anxiety Clinic and Anxiety Canada board member. I think we'll start with just some questions that probably all three of you can weigh in on. And there was a town hall already, and we're not going to go back over a lot of the same things, but perhaps just why is this time so difficult for those with anxiety? And we can start with you, Maureen.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate your time. So when we're talking about anxiety, it's so intertwined with uncertainty and future-oriented concerns that subsume uncertainty. And this is one big exercise in uncertainty. As you were talking about in your introduction, we don't know when this is going to end. We know that it will end, but we don't know when it's going to end. We don't know what it's going to look like or what our lives are going to look like. And very fundamental things that we have taken for granted here in North America, anyways, freedom of movement. Most of us have very, a reasonable amount of financial security. That all changed very quickly. Very quickly, our world changed, and we don't know what it's going to look like. And in the absence of knowing, for people who are anxious, there is a tendency to fill in those blanks or those missing variables with the worst case scenario. So people will assume the worst. In many people will, not everyone, but many people will assume the worst in the absence of that information. And that worst can be a pretty bleak scenario.
Well, with that said, Anne-Marie, what are the most common questions that you're seeing in your patients, and how are you addressing them?
I want to say one thing about what we're hearing from our patients, and I'm sure Melanie and Maureen hear this too. They're telling us, now you understand what we live with every day. Okay. Because the individual, as Maureen has offered, who lives with an anxiety disorder, lives with that feeling of dread. What can go wrong? When is that next thing going to drop on me? So the feeling of unpredictability of the world and the feeling of not being able to control what is going to happen or what's going on. So our patients, on the one hand, are feeling a little bit more understood. But on the other hand, not just our patients, but also new people who are calling us are worried about, how do I deal with this? How do I make myself get up every morning when it feels so frightening to get up? How do I go to the grocery store and come back without feeling that I've contaminated myself or brought something home to my family, right? So what we're hearing is a lot of what ifs. And I'm sitting here in New York City, and I think we are just around 200 people shy of having 9,000 deaths in the New York City area. So it's very frightening to our patients. And on top of just the fear about the virus and what can happen is also the management of their lives in very tiny spaces. This is New York City, where it's a luxury to have 700 square feet where, you know, you live. Usually your work is outside of that, but you know, for people who are in small apartments or just being in a New York City apartment building, being afraid to go onto the elevator and running into people down hallways. I live in a house, but even just going down the street to the park, there was a lot more mixing of people around. Now there's social distancing, and we're all, in fact, our governor has ordered us to wear masks. I think starting either tomorrow or Saturday, we all have to have masks from now on going outside. So a lot of what ifs from our patients and from others who are worried.
Melanie? I think your
Melanie,
mic's
are you muted?
There you go.
I just had all the solutions, but unfortunately I was muted. I'm also seeing the same thing, a lot of what if worries, but also a lot of problem solving difficulties. So helping people sort through, okay, you know, one of the things I've been doing is we've been drawing a circle in terms of what can we control and what can't we control. And for the stuff we can control, let's try and set some goals around things or do problem solving. And then for that other stuff, and right now there's a lot of the other stuff, how do we sit with that uncertainty? How do we deal with those what if worries? How do we make room for all that extra negative and difficult emotions? The other thing that I'm seeing a lot with people is this sort of blurred line between appropriate vigilance and hypervigilance, because you know, a day in the life for a person with anxiety disorder usually is trying to figure out, am I overestimating the threat here? Am I underestimating my ability to cope? And now that we have so much actual threat or potential threat, and it is harder to cope, you know, helping people, you know, dance that line and figure things out is, you know, it's challenging for everybody right now. In some ways, I think, you know, many of my clients who I've seen over a longer period of time, you know, have many skills and they're really using them right now, you know, to that regard, but it's hard. It's really hard to know. And it's changing. It's changing. What, you know, before you were like, no, I don't need a mask and I can feel good about that because it's going to a healthcare professional. And then you can wake up the next morning and it can be like, you should be wearing a mask. So it's hard. It's actually hard.
Yeah, and there's so many layers too, because people have children, and now the children are at home, and the children are anxious, and I obviously it differs with the age of the child. But what about advice for parents with kids that have not quite hit double digits and don't really understand, and they're anxious, they can't see their friends, and their routine is all thrown off?
Well, that's an excellent question, and one of the things that we tell parents first and foremost, I've been doing a lot of parenting webinars, is think about when you get on a plane and they're going through the safety check, you're taught to put the mask on yourself before you put them on your kids. So number one thing, and I could let Maureen and Melanie talk about this, is you've got to take a check of yourself and you've got to use coping skills for your anxiety. We'll talk about that in a second, but the importance of that is because kids resonate with the way you're feeling. We know this from prenatal studies that the developing child is resonating with the way a mother's heart rate is and her emotions. So number one thing is get your anxiety in check. And then the big thing for children is routines. And so we have a lot of kids here doing home-based learning. It's not the best for everyone, and it's not working so well in some places. But for the most part, getting your children up at the same time they should, Monday through Friday, having structured tasks for them, making sure you build in breaks for them. These are some of the things that have to happen. Getting movement in their day, because again, they're being confined. And like you say, they miss their friends and they need to see their friends. So what we have to set up is ways for them to do Zooming. And there's plenty of Zoom party games and various things for little kids. The big thing is for the parents to work out a way of helping their children to get through the day while they're taking care of their own work. So that's, as the child psychologist here, Melanie, I'm not sure if you are too, but I will say use reinforcers. If you all play nicely together while I do my work for the next 45 minutes, then we're going to bake cookies. And we'll let them cool for another 45 minutes while you do some more of your schoolwork and I could get mine done. And then we're going to eat them, so you've got to use reinforcers through the course of the day.
Well, what about, Melanie, for kids who are a little bit older and have just enough understanding about this to be scared about it, to actually be scared about what's going on and not just not being able to see their friends?
Yeah, and I would say that the same two basic skills, adding some structure and taking your own temperature and modeling healthy behaviors and healthy coping statements. So, one of the things we'll talk about later with the MindShift CBT app is, what can we do and how can we play with, our thoughts to make things better? And thoughts are, words and images in our head. So we can't actually, share our thoughts with our kids, but we can through our words and through our actions and model, healthy coping statements with them. So as, Anne-Marie said, take your own temperature, see where you're at, name it to tame it. I am feeling anxious. Like, it's okay to show your kids you're feeling sad, you're feeling anxious, giving them the words for that. And not just little kids need the words for that. Sometimes older kids need the words for it. Or you might, want to make sure, if there's gendered expectations, that you're saying, boys are allowed to be scared. They're allowed to be anxious too. Verbalizing things that maybe you wouldn't normally verbalize. And in terms of, adding structure, this is harder for some people than others, even if it's just watching the same TV show, one episode of the same TV show every night at 8 o'clock. Like, that's something, we're doing at our home and we're all looking forward to it. 8 o'clock. We get to watch an episode of a favorite show and just trying to build in some structure, which again ties into the idea of uncertainty, right? So there's a lot of things we can't control, but if we can add a little bit of, a structure that can help with the overall load, which is, pretty heavy these days.
Okay, Maureen, this is probably a big one, but introduce us to cognitive behavioral therapy and how it can be used in these times, real practical solutions for people at home.
Sure. How to do that succinctly is probably the biggest challenge, but I'll give it a shot. So cognitive behavior therapy, and the thing that I want to be really clear about is that everything that we will be talking about and have talked about is based on research. This is an evidence-based treatment that has started initially with depression in the kind of mid 60s, and then moved into treatment of anxiety disorders in the 70s, and really ramped up in the kind of mid 80s. And the research data that we have for treatment of anxiety disorders using cognitive behavior therapy is pretty solid. There's no quote unquote cure for anxiety, and there are pieces that if we didn't have anxiety or if we didn't have fear, we would be dead as a species. It stops us from doing silly things like stepping out in traffic or picking up something that looks like a rattlesnake. But in terms of treating cognitive behavior therapy, breaking it down using the name itself is we talk about the thoughts, and it turns out that people have some pretty characteristic ways of traps, cognitive traps that they can fall into. So I'll give you a couple of examples that might be consistent with our current context of COVID. that somebody goes into the grocery store, which is, I think, an anxiety-provoking situation for many people. And you look at somebody who might not be physically distancing, and you might, as an anxious person, might jump to a conclusion that that person's not physically distancing. Who knows what else they've done in their day? Now I'm at risk, and maybe I'm sick now because this person hasn't been appropriately attending. So jumping to a conclusion might be a really common thought trap that someone might fall into. So part of cognitive behavior therapy is helping people catch those very typical things that and errors in thinking, and the behavioral, and then starting to challenge and finding alternatives for some of that thinking. When we're talking about anxiety, what maintains anxiety for folks, whether it's a little bit of anxiety or something that really is interfering with how we function, is avoidance. It's not the only thing that keeps anxiety going, but it's a big factor. So that's the behavioral part, is that the way that I say it is that there's no way around anxiety. To get over it, you have to go through it. So that's the going into situations that produce some fear. So it might be going to that grocery store for people who who are taking that self-isolation as I'm not to go outside ever, 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 ever until we have a vaccine. So certainly that level of avoidance is not going to be helpful for that person. So going outside might be an example of what we would call an exposure exercise, exposing them to the anxiety and to the situation that they think is threatening and dangerous. When people get better from anxiety, largely, a couple of things happen. They get to learn that the things that they're afraid of, that they have overestimated the threat attached, or because threat is never zero, as we're seeing now, threat is never zero. When people have large amounts of anxiety, they are overestimating that threat, but also people get to see that they are underestimating their abilities to cope should something go sideways. So that's also part of what people can get out of doing some of the behavioral exercises. So in short, cognitive behavior therapy is about being aware of and also understanding how the whole thing, how the whole system functions. So there's a big educational component to start identifying thoughts, challenging thoughts, and reversing avoidance type behaviors.
Okay, so something you could work on, say, would be before you go to the grocery store, go outside once a day for a couple of days in a row.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Figure that's okay, and then try to make the next step to break through into the grocery store.
Yeah, and there's various different ways that people can engage in exposure. Some people like I call it the wade in approach. So starting at the shallow end and working in. Other people move in much more quickly, but it is basically about getting yourself into situations that you've avoided so that you get to learn that you can handle them.
And Anne-Marie, this must be extremely difficult, stuff like this for people in New York, as you said, small confined spaces, people living almost on top of each other, a lot of people in close proximity.
Yes. However, to build upon what we've heard from Maureen, a very important part of being able to challenge the way that we are thinking is by arming ourselves with factual information. And so a big thing for our clients, our patients, is turn off all those TV stations, get off of Twitter. Don't be looking online for information that will confirm your fears, which is the misinformation out there. But instead, look at in the US, the CDC, look at your reputable sources of medical and science information to tell you, you wash your hands before you go out, you put on a mask and you go. You could pick up vegetables, you can pick up food and such from the markets. And when you come home, you wash your hands again And there's plenty of very decent guidelines that will tell you that you don't have to go through a decontamination routine by dipping your vegetables in, solutions. Water is fine. So it's learning that you've got to find the facts and use those facts to challenge your thinking. And as Maureen said, do what is safe. And so social distance, a lot of stores are being great with allowing people in on a, step-by-step basis and helping folks to be one or two people in an aisle that can, have a comfortable social distance between one another. This is critical for us to know.
Now, is it different, the CBT, when used with children and adults, Melanie?
It's the same basic principles, but you adjust it to where a person is at. And if the kid is really small, you're focusing more on behavioral and the doing pieces. The thinking traps that Maureen was talking about, you can transform them to kid-friendly language. So one of the things we talk about is with adults, we might say black or white thinking or dichotomous thinking or all or nothing thinking. So it's like, we're all going to die from COVID, or we're all going to be okay. And I know now we're not all going to be okay. So we're all, this is, never going to be over. That kind of stuff. With kids, you can turn it into zebra thinking, and you can, change the language to, is there any chance we're doing zebra thinking here? And then you can give an example and you can make things more concrete. With the language, like, for example, facing our fears and not avoiding, you might call that brave behavior. And, we talked about this idea of reinforcement. So basically, paying attention to the behaviors that we want and praising them. And, you're so brave for, doing this particular thing that's scary for you right now. And the thing with working with people with anxiety disorders, it's very humbling. I had I've done so many different exposures with clients, and they're so some things are just, you would look at it and you would go, I don't really get that one myself, but we'll apply these principles that we know work from these scientific studies. And, one of the things that I've done in the past is an apple exposure, because I had a client who would not eat any food that hadn't been sterilized and put in sealed packages. And, and it was hard. And our wading in and our little steps, that apple exposure was extremely difficult for that client. And, I have apples. I eat apples regularly. And then the other day I picked up an apple and did I want the apple? I had a full body surge. And I thought it was very humbling, because I thought, I knew it was hard for that client to eat that apple, but, it's just it's some of these things that we, that we try, whether it's with kids or with adults, ourselves. We're doing experiments. For me, that's kind of the big thing about cognitive behavior therapy. One, based on, research and experiments about what helps, but also we have to do experiments ourselves. And with kids, you try and make them, fun. With adults, I also try to make them fun, but, figuring out what is going to make this anxiety worse and what's going to make it better.
Well, more in this stuff.
Can I just jump in for 1 second too? And Melanie and Maureen know this. For kids, parents can think about an acronym that a colleague of ours, Dr. Phil Kendall, came up with many, many years ago. He's the father, or the grandfather, he's old, the grandfather of cognitive behavior therapy with kids. And the acronym is FEAR. The F stands for, am I feeling frightened? For the child to sort of self-assess and let their parents know, I'm feeling frightened or I'm worried. Then E, am I expecting bad things to happen? Am I expecting mom's going to die or grandma's going to die because of this, or we're going to die if we're going to get contaminated? Identifying their fear, and it validates that, okay, you've got this and these are your thoughts. Then what attitudes can I take to challenge that fear? And the attitudes are, mom and dad are teaching me how to be safe by washing my hands and wearing masks, and we're staying at home. That's why we're doing school. So those are attitudes, you know, to challenge what I'm thinking, and what actions can I take by wearing the mask. And we're going to go out and play, and we might not see our friends face up and right in front of one another, but across the park from one another, we can wave and such. F, E, A, and then R, reinforce myself. Yes, you know, for how I'm coping in this way. So the fear steps are very important for teaching this cognitive behavioral approach to kids.
I mean, it seems easy when you three are talking about these things and succinctly explaining them. But Maureen, how can people practice these skills at home on their own when there isn't an expert talking face to face?
Yeah, so that's the beauty of cognitive behavior therapy, is that, and the way that I talk about it with the folks that I see, is that I am teaching you to be your own therapist. That in the time that we see each other, we'll take out a chunk of this, but more importantly, you're going to learn the skills to be able to help yourself. So, and Melanie, I think will talk more about this, but our app, the MindShift CBT app, sets people up really well to identify, and using some of the acronym that Anne-Marie just talked about, identifying the fear situations, what they might be expecting, and the actions that they can take, and not to forget to congratulate yourself, because this is difficult. That we're in a very difficult time and place and situation, and that anything that we do that challenges us, doesn't matter if it doesn't challenge somebody else, if it challenges us and we do it and we face that fear, that we need to give ourselves a pat on the back for that, because that will help encourage us to do more of it. So practicing at home is being able to identify what those situations are, how they're coping, the thing that they're doing to try to eliminate that avoidance, and then working to reverse that in step-by-step fashion, and using some of the skills that we have on Anxiety Canada to help you with that.
Same thing with trying to teach those skills to children, Anne-Marie, at home?
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm talking to you all from, you know, below your border in the other part of the bottom half of North America, the middle. And I use your app all the time. And I actually send parents all the time to the Anxiety Canada website, because there are beautiful pages that parents can print out for their kids to do practices on how to identify and challenge their thoughts, and then also how to put into place little exposure plans for things, everything from getting ready for school and going to school, to sleeping in their own bed if they're separation anxious, various kinds of things for obsessive compulsive disorder in children. These all can be managed by kids when they are made age appropriate. And so there's great flexibility with cognitive behavior therapy. More parent involvement for the younger children, and smaller steps, and being very concrete and one thing at a time with littler kids. And then as you get up into the teenage years, we could be more complex in the way that we address, because their thinking is more complex and their catastrophizing is much more involved, because they can think about probabilities and likelihood in a way that is, you know, a very adult-like. And their lives are more complicated because they're juggling social connections as well as academics work and such. So there's plenty that we could do with them too, that is just all around the same, addressing their cognitions and then working in a step-by-step way on what we call exposures, exposing to what they're afraid of.
Well, Melanie, maybe you can talk about the MindShift app a little bit. I downloaded it last week and found it very easy to navigate. And the first question it asks you when you go on it is, how are you feeling today? And then you click on an answer and it guides you from there. So perhaps tell us a little bit about MindShift and then how it can help people when they're home by themselves.
Great. So the MindShift CBT app is based on research showing that cognitive behavior therapy is helpful for anxiety. And so that's important to know, because if you're going to invest in learning something, whether it's piano or, a new sport, you want to, it's got to be worth it, because it does take some work. And so if you're learning to be your own cognitive behavior therapist, you want some buy-in. You want to see some results for all your hard work. And so it starts off, and yes, you can check in and see, where your anxiety is at. The app is designed to be very intuitive, so that, once you download it, it's free, it's private. We're not, Anxiety Canada is not collecting any of the data and selling it to people. It's Anxiety Canada is a nonprofit organization. So, once you get in there, it's private, and you can track your symptoms, and that can be really helpful too, because sometimes, when we're getting better or when we're getting worse, we don't notice it, and this is a way that you can track to see how, see how you're doing over time. I think the things that I would like to focus on, since we don't have, 10 hours, and I'm sure I could easily talk for that long, is the tools, is jump right to the tools. And so the cognitive, that's a fancy way for thinking. The behavioral, that's for the doing stuff. There is one tool section called healthy thinking. And in that, there are a number of different tools you can use. One of them is a thought journal. So you've heard us talk about these thinking traps that people can fall into. The thought journal is really good because it will start off with, what are you worried about? And you have a little space and you can kind of type in what you're worried about. And then it brings up like a thinking trap menu. So you can look through that and go, oh, am I jumping to a conclusion here? Am I catastrophizing or imagining that worst case scenario? And you can kind of look through, and basically, like that E in the fear and those expectations, you can reality check your expectations. And that is so useful right now. I think we all need to, kind of do that. And this just makes it very concrete. It's a helpful tool for doing that. And then it brings you to, untwisting that thinking, come up with a more balanced thought, be a little bit more flexible. That's that kind of attitude. How are we looking at things? And it's really good because, like when you're first learning piano or something else, having some structure and tools, a class to go to is a lot easier than, just trying to figure out how to play piano from looking at a piano, right? It's very helpful. The other things that people might like right now is there's some coping cards in that healthy thinking section, so you can go through and just get some ideas for healthy coping statements, and you can even create your own. So if you've heard somebody saying something like this isn't going to last forever, or something that has really resonated with you, and you're like, yeah, that seems like logical, and I feel kind of grounded, and when you say it out loud to your kids, they respond. You can actually put that in there, put a quote in there. It's really great. And then when you're feeling really anxious, you can pull it out. You can go through your coping cards, and they're all nicely, in your phone. I used to do coping cards with people, and I still do sometimes, and had my CUCARDs. So those are a couple things in the healthy thinking section. I'm getting sick of the sound of my own voice, so I'll try and be quick. There's a taking action section that helps you figure out how to, like, Maureen mentioned that wading in the pool. Sometimes we think of these like ladders that we can sort of climb towards our goals. That helps you kind of break down your fears and work your way towards goals. So that can be really helpful, as well as a healthy habits section. Because right now, self-care, healthy self-care is something that is, it's always good for all of us, but there's some tips there. And also you can use the app to set goals. So you can write down what your goal is, and then it will give you a reminder. And so if you're not good at kind of implementing that structure to your day, at least setting a reasonable goal for yourself, ideally once a day, but, wherever you're at, that can be really helpful too. And then the last kind of main tool is the chill zone. And so, even if you've been listening and you're like, cognitive, that's too fancy of a word, behavior, whatever, I don't know, that I don't think that's for me. I do think that the chill zone is a good, entry zone to MindShift CBT. If you're not sure about the other stuff, can teach you how to calm some of that over arousal that we have right now, that physiology of fear that, like Maureen said, keeps you from running into traffic and stuff. it's our bodies are revving right now. If your body isn't revving, it's really exhausted. So this is a way to kind of kick over from the body's gas, which is our sympathetic nervous system that readies us for action, to our parasympathetic nervous system. That's the body's break or rest and digest that helps us kind of recharge. So you can go to the chill zone, do some nice breathing, some imagery. There's a nice body scan where you can kind of focus on the different areas of your body and get grounded. So, I mean, I think those tools are really useful. And, you know, the app is not designed for kids, but like the body scan and the breathing, you could do with, I think, any age, really. And that's something you could do together as a family. Again, you could pick a time of day that you all get together and you take your little 5-minute breathing break. And so those are some, you know, kind of highlights of MindShift CBT. But again, it's free. You can download it, whether you have Apple or you have iOS or you have Google Play. You know, you can get it and just play around with it. It's meant to be played around with. So you can go and you can kind of like press little things. That's the beauty of it, is you don't need a professional to guide you through it. Though if you have one, that's going to be helpful, of course.
Okay, you're gonna have to talk some more because I have 2 follow-up questions to that.
Oh.
You need to hear your voice a little more. You said it's not for kids. Could you sit down with your child and ask them the questions and go through the answers and go through the procedures with them while you're using the phone and asking the questions to them?
Well, I mean, Anne-Marie is really our child expert, but anxietycanada.com, Anxiety Canada's website, has materials that are specifically geared towards children and has a series of free courses called My Anxiety Plans maps that are geared specifically towards children. So even in terms of, say, like the breathing exercises, like the ones that are on the My Anxiety Plan have you, you know, like picture the balloon, and they're more child friendly. So I would start with the website and My Anxiety Plan for kids. For adolescents, teens, and adults, you know, a lot of people just like fiddling on their phone. But again, Anxiety Canada has tried to make the website and the MAPS program workable on, you know, smartphones and iPads and things like that.
And Marie, you said you've been on the app quite a bit. Would this be something also for someone that has not been diagnosed with anxiety or OCD or any sort of mental illness, but someone just in these times might be feeling just a little wound up? Could you go on there and use some of the same practices?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we bear in mind again that whether it's anxiety or sadness, frustration, joy, all of these are basic human emotions that we experience just by being a part of the world. And so we all go through anxiety states at various times, given whether the bills are due or a work product has to be turned in, whatever it might be. And so something like, I mean, I send a lot of just friends and family to use MindShift just because it's quite helpful. And then as Melanie is saying, you know, because this is part of the human condition to experience these things, and it's okay for us to use tools. We should use tools. They're available to us. This is, you know, it's great that we have technology that, I mean, when you think about it, if you're going to head off to the grocery store, a lot of people will, like my husband and I, it's like, what do we need this week? We make a list. It helps us organize our thinking so that when we get there, we get what we need. That's like a tool, a list, making it. So the same thing with managing your emotions, making use of mindfulness techniques and using the app that helps you, you know, breathe in and breathe out in a certain way is so helpful, because you learn how to get it then more quickly. Definitely. And you definitely can do these things with your children next to you and make it a family activity, let's say.
Yeah. And Maureen, right now, because people are at home, you can navigate these by yourself and you don't have to go anywhere. And you can, it's just, like I said, fairly intuitive, and you can go on and just check out what you need to check out. Right? Okay. Do you guys want to see if we have some questions from some of the viewers? I have one here. The question is, do you have any strategies for working remotely and trying to balance a strong work ethic with guilt about not working for several hours straight, especially if I've already experienced anxiety before?
Go ahead,
Maureen, do you want to
Maureen.
start?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. So I think we've talked a little bit about the importance of a schedule and how grounding and important that is. I'll use myself as an example. I'm an early morning person, so I have continued to get up within about 20 or 30 minutes of when I get up in the, before the world changed. I stick to that. I have to lever myself out of bed every morning, but I do it because I know that it's really important. So I do my morning routine. It's a different routine than it was 6 weeks ago, but I'm still doing a routine that's very grounding for me. And then my work starts, and I think my work's a little bit different than other people because it's tied to still doing therapy, which I still do online. But I think the importance of having a break for a bit. So working for a bit and then taking a defined break. So I'm going to work for 45 minutes and then I'm going to take a 15-minute break. And then I'm going to work for 45 minutes and then I'm going to take a 15-minute break. Understanding that, and the caller mentioned guilt, and that guilt might be coming from having expectations of yourself that may or may not be reasonable in this new context. So with the understanding that we're all going to do what we can do and do what we can. And I have stopped using, what's the phrase? Just do the best that you can. I've stopped using that phrase because for people who are very perfectionistic, there's no endpoint to that. No matter how much you do, I can always do better. So I'd like to see people reorient to, I'm going to do what I can under the circumstances that I'm currently in, which means that there's going to be some wiggle room. Some days you're going to be more productive than others, and focus on what went well as opposed to the things that did not go well. With the idea that if you are encouraging of yourself, you're going to be much more likely to approach the next day with in a better mindset, if you will, to be able to try to get the most out of that day.
And Anne-Marie,
And
it's a
if I
question.
could,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but if I could add into here too, our environments, if you think about this, your work environment has changed. And your home environment has changed because they're one now. And so one of the things that's helpful for some folks and for most of us is find that place in your house, that corner or the desk or wherever it might be. And again, for those people who have very small spaces, find a space that is going to be your work area. And that's where you're going to work. That doesn't mean you don't get up and move around to get your lunch or do, but find a place where it's going to be work so that you can get away from that. Even if it means you're on the other side of the room for watching television or doing exercise or something. This is important to help you too feel that you're more in control of what is a workspace and a work mode.
Mm-hmm. And Melanie, because the question, there was kind of 3 layers. Anxious, had suffered anxiety before, now feeling anxious from working at home and not getting the same amount of work done that usually is done in that time frame.
Yeah. And so we have talked about thinking traps a few times during this town hall. And one common thinking trap is the shoulds, right? And this is, I should be doing this and I should be doing that. And the world is quite different now, but many of us kind of, join the party, maybe anxiety prone or shame prone or guilt prone. And there's a big difference between doing something bad and not doing something good, right? And so, in the MindShift CBT app, you can select the thinking trap, the shoulds. And, there is a difference between, changing something from a should to a I would like to, or I have the goal that. You can use the goals section and say, okay, well, I notice I can't seem to work for 45 minutes in a row anymore. Then maybe your goal is to work for half an hour, not working for 45 minutes anymore, but being very concrete. And then again, that are for reinforcement. And again, reinforcement is just doing things to increase the likelihood of behavior. So give yourself a reward, a little treat, or, spend some time doing something that you enjoy. Use the goal setting. But I think right now, many of us just don't feel like we're doing enough, and I think being very concrete about setting our goals and saying, okay, I'd like to do more, but today I'm gonna, do this one thing for myself. I'm gonna floss my teeth because I normally forget that. And then I'm also gonna, call an elderly loved one. And that's what I'm doing.
And if I could just add to what Melanie was saying, it triggered something that we were talking about in our group recently. And I think there's a bit of a trend on social media as to who can outdo whom in terms of productivity level. Turn that stuff off because like much of social media, it doesn't necessarily present what is the realistic for most people. So while you might not be writing the next great novel and studying Chinese, and do what you can do and don't compare to anybody else.
Okay, good advice. Anne-Marie, perhaps this one's for you, a question. Are there any online live support groups in the US particularly, or other options for online support in general?
Well, that is a very good question. And there's different, we have telehealth, and throughout, I think, North America, various clinicians and organizations are doing support groups and telehealth groups. So our social anxiety groups, for example, are running online for the teenagers as well as adults. Our parenting groups are running online. And then there are organizations that are going online for their type of support. And this, you can search for these in meetups. If you all have, you use meetup.com. And those are more support, not therapy, which is important because they're not curated by a therapist or led by a therapist. But I think the sky's the limit with what people can find in, by searching for whether it's a self-help group, a support group, or then online therapy through telehealth.
Okay. Another question. I'm experiencing a lot of physical symptoms, especially a constant butterfly feeling in my stomach. What can I do to manage?
Okay. And certainly some of the things and first of all, you're not alone. Look at the person who's 2 meters away from you, and they will be probably having the same thing. So try not to get upset with yourself that you might be experiencing some of these physical sensations, because those are very common physical sensations that are associated with anxiety. So maybe have a look at some of the thinking that is going on, and are you potentially falling into some of those cognitive traps, and start to use some of the tools on Anxiety Canada to see if you can identify what they are and maybe challenge and come up with alternatives. But also to some of when our bodies get revved, a couple really nice ways to balance it out. If you have the ability to do some cardiovascular exercise, super helpful thing to do. The other thing that would be helpful, I said 2, so maybe 3, some mindfulness strategies. So a little bit of, and you can go on to, there's so many different ways of doing mindfulness. But some of what's on Anxiety Canada, somebody was talking about body scan earlier, that could be a helpful thing. And basic relaxation type strategies to try to let some of that, I like to call it, let the air out of the balloon a little bit, would be what I would suggest.
Okay. Here's one that I think that a lot of people would ask. How can you start a conversation about anxiety and start to open up and share when I myself don't even know what's going on with me, especially if they don't understand anxiety or mental health either? So trying to self-diagnose and start a conversation with someone else that might not have any idea either. Anne-Marie, do you want to take?
Anne-Marie, you go.
Oh, then feel free to jump in here, Maureen. You know, that's an interesting thing. And I'll go back to the research that was conducted in the 80s with individuals who suffered with panic disorder with agoraphobia. For the long term before that, these individuals might have been treated with medication or classic therapies. And an interesting thing is whenever someone got well, they found that there was more of an observation that their relationships broke up. How in the world? What happened? People were, breaking up after the person with panic felt better. Well, my mentor, Dr. David Barlow, and his team started working with individuals with panic and agoraphobia to bring the partner or spouse into the therapy. And we would do groups with these individuals where we actually had the partner experience a panic attack. And we did this by making them hyperventilate, really breathing like that for 2 minutes. So they were overwhelmed with all these sensations. And, you'd question them like, what are you feeling? It's like, oh my gosh, my heart's racing. I'm breathless and my chest is pounding. And are you afraid of that? No. Why? Because you made me do this. I know I hyperventilated. But what if you had been driving over a bridge and all of a sudden you felt these sensations, or just sitting in your living room and all of a sudden you felt these sensations? And the partner would invariably say, well, of course that would scare me. Well, that's what a panic attack is. It seems to come from out of the blue, you don't recognize, and that's what anxiety feels like. Now, I'm not suggesting you go and make your friends hyperventilate. That's not the point, but maybe it is. But the thing that you can do is give them something to understand. Remember the first time you went skiing. Really remember back to the first time you got up on top of the hill up there, in British Columbia where the mountains are so high. Remember the first time you rode a bike as a little kid. Remember the first time you got behind the wheel of a car. What were you feeling? Shaky, heart racing, upset, and, wondering, can I do this? Am I going to crash? Am I going to burn? What would have happened if after you did this and went down the green slope or the bunny slope the first time? What would have happened if you just went into the ski lodge and never went back up again? Well, you'd feel better. Or what would happen if you never took the second driver's ed lesson? Oh, you wouldn't be anxious anymore. But then what about the next opportunity when your class went skiing or you had to get in a car again? You'd be just as anxious as the first time. It takes practice. So this is the thing to help people who don't get it understand. We all have anxiety. However, we have learned how to control it to do the things we need to do or we want to enjoy. But there are some times when anxiety gets the best of us. And here, anxiety has gotten the best of this person for some reason. It's not that it's not real. It's not that it's not upsetting. It's that they have this, they experience this, and there can be help for them. You've got to let them be validated that this is a real thing.
Yes, I think that, knowledge is power, and figuring out what's going on for yourself is really useful. But sometimes we do need a healthcare professional to help us figure that out. It's harder for some people to identify different emotions, different feelings, to know, what's going on, and then to go that step, that next step to explain them. So sometimes we need a professional to help us both with understanding and explaining to a partner. Sometimes we can do all of that on our own. I mean, I would suggest anybody who's thinking, what's going on with these butterflies, or I'm sweating more, or I'm like feeling these weird tingly sensations in my hands, as psychologists who treat anxiety would be like, well, that's because your body's preparing you for fight or flight or for freezing, which would be really useful if there was an actual, threat in front of you, and we could explain to you what's happening in the body. But not everybody has access to, a professional. And so at least learning about that kind of basic anxiety 101, what is the physiology of fear? What's happening in your body? What are different emotions? What are the common ways that people think when they're feeling certain things? What are the common things we do? I think if you can try to educate yourself, that's really useful. And sometimes, you just kind of keep it simple and say, I'm not okay. You know, try and use whatever words you have and what other words somebody else will will understand, rather than just like holding it on all in and saying nothing. So I say, I mean, this is really basic, but say something.
Mhm.
Anything.
This is
Just start the conversation if you can.
This is a good follow-up to that, and to the viewer with the butterflies. My daughter, 9 years old, always shaking her legs when she's anxious. What should I do to help her?
I would start by asking her, tell me how you doing right now, and encouraging her to talk. Now, you can't force it, and she might say, I'm fine. And you could say, you know, I'm sitting here and I'm actually feeling a little anxious because I have to get work done and I didn't get it done today. So to start modeling, talking about your feelings. But then you can, you know, also say to her, well, you know, I'm wondering if you are worried about anything that's going on. Is there anything with school or your friends? So you can question her. But then the other thing is, I wouldn't pay a lot of attention there, except what I might open up to is, I want to do something with you today. Let's do this belly breathing together. And I would model for her and take her through, and I think MindShift helps with this in a beautiful way, how to do deep diaphragmatic breathing where you feel you have a tube running down your throat that lands in a balloon that's in your tummy, and how to breathe in slowly and inflate the balloon and then exhale to deflate it. Because if you start giving her a tool for deep breathing and relaxing, this might help her. And you could say, what's the difference between how we feel before and after doing the breathing? Were you a robot and now you're a rag doll? Do you see the difference between robot and rag doll by using that breathing? And it might help her to start expressing herself and identifying her anxious state.
We have about 3 minutes left here, but I think this might be a good one to end on because it kind of covers a lot of things we've touched on, especially during the world right now. I'm working remotely and have to juggle working at home and being available for my children and run a household. I'm anxious all the time and it's not good for my family. What can I do?
You mean you can't do it all? Who can do it all in this context? None of us can do it all. Goes back to, I think, partly some of what I said a little bit earlier. We're going to do what we can in the situation that we're in. And it might not be up to what we would normally do, but give yourself a bit of a break for doing what you can in a very difficult situation. So some of that, looking at what the expectations you're placing on yourself, and seeing, you know, would I have those same expectations of a friend? Should my friend be able to get all his or her work done, run the household, run school lessons, and still have time to kick back? It's just not going to be possible, I think. And so I think there has to be some level of acceptance, if you will, that we're in a new context and a situation, and it is okay to not do everything that we did 6 weeks ago, because our landscape is just different. So some of it is prioritizing, and then working on those priorities, just like you did before, but it's more about the amount that you're expecting of yourself. And I think it has to change because our world has changed.
I think we can get one more question in. Last one, 2 minutes. I worry that my fears and anxieties are not valid, but I'm struggling with a lot of anxiety. What can I do?
Your feelings are valid because they're your feelings. Just so number one thing is allow yourself to feel. And own that whatever this is coming from in terms of these feelings you're having, it's important to you. You're experiencing this. The thing we want to do, and I'm going to go back to an airplane analogy here, is make sure that our feelings are packed in, and we could hold them in a carry-on bag that fits in the overhead. if they're spilling out on your head or other people's, then you can take stock of what's getting in the way of you being able to cope well, and of you being able to make your way more comfortably in the world and live the life you want to live. And this is where reaching out for help, reaching to MindShift, taking a look at what's online at Anxiety Canada, and I'm the US American here telling you to go to this, that's going to be helpful to you. So, but let yourself feel.
And if I could just add one thing in addition, and we've talked about this, but limit exposure to the news, because there's you can do deep dives everywhere, and it's not going to take you to any good place. And not that you're going to stick your head in the sand, but to really kind of keep it contained and keep it to reputable sources, whether it's the CDC in the US, whether it's the Provincial Centers for Disease Control or Health Canada. Keep it reputable, but keep it contained, and focus on, as Melanie said, focus on what you can control as opposed to what is no longer in our control.
Well, this has been fantastic, Melanie and Maureen, thanks so much for taking time out of your day and offering some real practical and concrete solutions for people that are struggling, especially during these uncertain times. So we just appreciate the advice so much, and we'd love to hear more from you three down the road.
Thank you so much.
That'll be it for this town hall presented by Anxiety Canada. Thank you all for tuning in, and please check out the website for further discussions on anxiety and how to cope with some of these problems. Thank you.